Ngā mihi nui ki a koe, te whare nui I tēnei, tēnā koe, te whare wānanga, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everybody. I was a little surprised to get asked to speak by Ken. I'm not actually a specialist in sexual violence or sexual violence in regards to men and boys. However, I think in doing this work kind of pushed me to explore this issue a bit more in relation to some of the work I do. However, what I think I might be able to bring to the conference is looking as some insight into the way in which the policies of governments or big structures like governments, how they operate at a macro level or at a large scale, and how they can affect families and communities. And in particular, the way I'm looking at it is in relation to Māori and the way in which colonisation, or the way in which the New Zealand government over 160, 170 years or so impacted Māori families and communities in a way that we've seen violence flow from the outside and into the inside, from the outside of these communities and families and into the inside of those communities and families. Just a little bit of personal background. On my mother's side, I'm connected to Ngāti Pīkeo, which is a tribe in the North Island, but I work for Ngāi Tahu, which is a tribe here in the South Island. And you probably, those of you who are here on the first day, would have had Mark Solomon. Mark was on the first day. And Mark was the chief of Ngāi Tahu for a number of years. And so that's who I've worked for Ngāi Tahu. I was the development manager there, where I was responsible for looking after tribal social and economic development. And then later I moved into the Ngāi Tahu Research Centre, where we're half funded by the University of Canterbury here in Christchurch and half funded by the tribe Ngāi Tahu, where we look at a whole bunch of different issues for the tribe's social and economic development issues. But underneath, I'm a development anthropologist, so I tend to look at all the sort of interconnected, interwoven the way issues sort of unfold. But one project I have been involved in leading, and it's part of a broader program, and that program is called He Koko Ngā Whare. And that program has looked at the way in which historical trauma, and the way in which trauma rolls down through families across generations, and the ways in which broader structures like governments and so on can then impact those communities to cause these flow-on effects. And so that's kind of, I'll talk a bit about that project as part of the talk. But just to begin with, I'm just going to start the talk by providing some scene setting. I'm going to look at some sort of the global and New Zealand perspective with some statistics. This is just to provide a framework for thinking throughout the rest of the talk, once I've covered those statistics, just to kind of build a bit of a frame. And then I'll go into sort of looking at Māori historical trauma and the conditions, creating these conditions for sexual violence. And I'll look at the Ngāi Tahu case study. And then last of all, I'll look at particularly at the effects of colonisation on Māori male identity and then the impacts that might have, particularly sexual identity. And then I'll provide some conclusions looking at how some of these issues may be dealt with that I will raise. So the first thing I did was start looking at data, and I was, because I tend to like to start there because I can, and particularly I was trying to look at, is there any long-term data trends concerning sexual violence against Māori men and boys? Can I look back 150 years and look at what's been happening in that area? And so I could connect what was happening in those families to what's happening outside or in these broader structures and broader things happening in society generally. The truth is that there was very little of anything to find, and if there was things, I didn't have the time to dig down, for example, in terms of police records and so on. And I suppose what most stood out was nearly all of the data was orientated toward domestic violence, and particularly looking at Māori men against Māori women in terms of that violence. So it was very difficult to tease out from that any particular trends or relationships. So what I started to do is play on Excel a little bit and see what I could come up with. And the first thing I was looking at was some of the studies around unwanted sexual interactions. And what that study was saying, I'm not sure if you can see it where you are, it's kind of small, but the far left column is males, the middle column is Maori males, and then the right column is females, just from the general population in New Zealand. Now the middle, there was no specific data around Maori males in terms of unwanted sexual interactions. However, the general statistic that I kept finding everywhere, and from Te Puna Kōkiri, which is the Ministry of Māori Development, was that Maori male rates of sexual abuse or unwanted sexual interactions were about twice that of the national average. So that statistic there is showing around sort of 32.5% of Maori males with unwanted sexual interactions. But as I'll go on, a lot of reporting involves issues around disclosure, but which I'll discuss shortly. But so that sort of gives you some idea, perhaps. We don't really know. I don't think the data's really there, but it just gives some sort of little ballpark figure to think about it. Now, this is around childhood sexual abuse, and everyone knows the kind of Dunedin studies and most people know about Dunedin studies and the Christchurch studies. But this one here is looking at a longitudinal study, and a very detailed longitudinal study. And within that study, it was finding that males in New Zealand, the child sexual abuse rate of around 6%. But once again, if we add in the Te Puna Kōkiri sort of assessment that it's about twice that, we might say that among Māori males that the childhood sex abuse rate might be around 12%. But there's another point that I want to make, and because this is an international audience, that these are different. Once again, this is forced sexual initiation across different countries. I haven't named the countries just because the kind of the point of the graph is to show that in different countries there's different rates for a variety of reasons, I'm sure. Some because some areas are war-torn, or perhaps some cultures won't disclose if sexual abuse has happened. But this is from the World Health Organization. But what it says is that there's different countries have different rates, but also different cultures have different rates of sexual abuse. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer in a way, but it's good to point out these differences do occur, and to explain why do we have these differences. But we also have this issue of disclosure. So this is actually, and most studies are of disclosed abuse, of course, because if you do a survey or if you ask someone, have you been sexually abused or have you been involved in some sort of unwanted sexual interaction, it depends on someone disclosing that has happened. So there's some surveys there from sort of 1990 to 2017, and some of the large national surveys are showing that in terms of disclosed sexual abuse among males. The American study in 1990 was saying about 15%, Canadian study about 8%, the British National Survey about 8%, World Health Organization more recently talking about it varying between 3.6 and 20% rates of sexual abuse. Other studies showing between 5 and 10%, but you can see just these huge ranges of what sexual abuse is thought to be, or the ranges that's involved. But I think one of the most important things around the data, when I was looking at it and trying to make sense of it, is that males are very unlikely to disclose abuse. And if we look at some studies here, and these are Petit and Hughes, this is way back in 1985, were saying that males were about only 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 males will likely ever disclose that they were sexually abused. O'Leary, which was a large study, which it was a meta-study, so he looked at multiple cases of research around disclosure. And he was saying from all of those studies, they found that 73.8% of men will not disclose sexual abuse in comparison to 36.4% of women. Now, this aligns with Mewlin's study here in New Zealand, where she was finding that about 40% of females don't disclose. So what you're seeing here is perhaps the figure that we can see is only about a quarter of what the actual rates may be based on disclosure. But because it's sort of this unknown area, it's kind of difficult to kind of work out. Now, I hope you can see that. If anybody has any problem seeing anything, or just put your hand up and so I can explain it, or you want me to explain anything in more detail, just ask. But here is a graph, and what it is this is from Child, Youth and Family, and I was just playing around with it yesterday, and this is looking at rates of emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse and neglect. And these are care and protection notifications to Child, Youth and Family here in New Zealand. And you can see here that the rates of sexual violence toward Māori males, the rates of sexual violence track very closely with the rates of sexual abuse track very closely with the rates of violence. Whereas you're not seeing it track with emotional abuse or neglect. They seem to be not as correlated, whereas you see that violence and sexual abuse tend to be quite tightly correlated. So from that perspective, I'm kind of thinking maybe you can extrapolate, look at, if you're wanting to know what trends are, we've got much better statistics around trends for violence, so perhaps tracking levels of violence will enable you to track levels of sexual violence toward men and boys, or sexual violence in general. And once we know the levels of sexual violence, the numbers of victims of sexual violence, we'll be able to extrapolate what's happening in that space. Now, another thing I came across yesterday also was the police apprehensions for sexual assault on children. And so this was apprehensions in New Zealand. And so this graph is for boys under 12 and girls under 12. And what the graph is showing is that girls are 4 times more likely to have someone apprehend. What it's saying is that there's been 4 times more apprehensions for sexual abuse against girls than sexual abuse against boys, and since 2006 to 2014. And but when you look at the statistics of the rates of abuse for boys, and if you take what they currently are, which says it's about half that for girls, then this numbers, the apprehensions for boys is significantly too low. And particularly if you take into account what isn't disclosed, you might be able to see that that should be more like in parallel. There should be relatively similar levels between girls and boys for physical abuse. So what it kind of suggests is there's some sort of systemic bias going on in the area. And then if we look again at 12 to 16-year-olds, once again, it then jumps to 6.7 times the amount of police apprehensions for girls in regards to boys. So what it suggests is that, that the rate should be significantly higher for boys, just going off what we already know around the statistics of child abuse rates for boys in relation to girls. So there's a number of questions going on there. But I've just provided those stats just because they'll provide a conceptual foundation to where I'm going now. They'll provide a bit of background into the Māori historical trauma area. So now, just drawing upon the idea that violence and sexual violence go hand in hand, or they track together statistically. This graph here is Māori imprisonment rates. And that's since 1860, and that's adjusted for the portion of the population. And what it shows is that until about the 1930s, Māori imprisonment rates were about half that of Pākehā. And just bearing in mind that nearly half of those imprisonments are for violence. So if we're correlating violence with sexual violence, you can kind of get an idea that what's tracking there is probably likely to be also what's tracking in terms of sexual violence within Māori communities. So now, and just so about 50% of those are related to violent incarcerations are related to violence. Now, we've also seen something quite incredible happen within Māori communities since about 1987. Now, in the period of, between 1978 and 1987, in 1978, the child abuse rate among Māori was about the same as Pākehā. And between 1987 to today, that figure has gone up sixfold within a 40-year period, a 40-year period. So what we're seeing is it's stabilised at that level, but it's been seen a rapid increase. But this isn't, when we look back, and there were very low levels of imprisonment and violence within Māori communities early on in New Zealand's colonisation period. And even in the pre-contact period, when you have a look there, you can see comments from colonists. In this case, this was Marsden commenting, "There can be no finer children than those of the New Zealanders, the Māori, in any part of the world. Their parents are very indulgent and they appear always happy and playful and very active." And this is so the next one's a comment around the relationship between Māori fathers and their children in the sort of early contact period. "A considerable portion of his time is spent in nursing his infant. He was devotedly fond of his children. They are his pride, his boast, his peculiar delight. He generally bears the burden of carrying them continually within his mat." And this isn't just a one-off sort of comment. These comments are found all throughout the early records and early letters written between Māori of a particular level of care and respect and a particular strong relationship between men and their children within traditional Māori structures and communities. And so we've seen something pretty serious unravel in the last 150 years. Another one is that we've seen that the high levels of suicide among Māori. Now, until the 1950s, the Māori suicide rate was about half that of the general population. And so, and it just steadily started to grow since the 1950s. And Māori suicides are now heavily concentrated among the young. Older generations, you don't see it as much. But younger generations, it's very high. I think it's currently the highest in the world of any culture. And nearly a quarter of all those suicides occur in prison in New Zealand. And so what we've seen is an absolute explosion in the levels of suicide in the last 70 years or so among Māori. And also some interesting stuff from the pre-1950s was that many psychologists and psychiatrists are actually looking at Māori as examples of excellent mental health, as examples to the rest of the world about how you could actually, of people that were extremely psychologically well. And back then the research was putting it down to the psychological security of living within tribes. And this is a comment from the Beagle Holes. I think this was in the New Zealand Department of Health in 1947. The fact that there are fewer neurotic and psychotic illnesses among the Māori than among Pākehās in New Zealand emphasises, among other things, the tremendous values to the Māori of possessing a psychological security that comes from tribal and family security. So the question is, why such a massive change? Why such a massive shift? And so these are sort of the questions that we explore. And this is kind of how I kind of see it, and I hope you can all see it. And so on the outside, we've got these society structures, and then inside that, we've got communities, inside that, we've got families, inside that, we've got individuals. So what you do is you have outer structures that affect the inner structures, and the way in which things travel down. Of course, things travel back the other way too, but you definitely have an effect of power structures and the way they affect individuals and families. So what we have is this kind of situation, to make things, put things in a pretty simple sense, is that you have, and I'm sure this is replicated across other countries and other areas, within settler states you have a form of what you call structural violence that starts to break down the protective barriers across those different levels. So for Māori that was hapu, and hapu means, it actually is a metaphor, and it means to be pregnant. So hapu is like the metaphor for the kinship group or the border community, and it means to be protected or to be kept inside, where you're able to grow. And so that's where the term hapu kind of originates. Now inside that was whānau, and whānau is like the interconnected network of families, and inside that the individual. So the idea, or the whole metaphor, the whole idea around it was that it was a protective layer, a sort of protective fabric. And what happens is that fabric becomes undermined through this process of where that settlers, the structures start to penetrate and undermine as those different levels to affect the individual. Now, this isn't to say that sexual violence didn't occur in Māori communities or to build up some romantic ideal, but to say that certainly you've seen that the rates of all these issues have gone through the roof in the last 150 years, tenfold the increase in a lot of these problematic areas around sexual violence. So with those sort of contexts in mind, I just want to explore a case study. And this case study is with Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu. And if you can see the photo there, there's Mark when he was a young man up on the left next to Sir Tipene O'Regan, who led the claim settlement process or the healing process with the government around settling past wrongs around land acquisition. And so it just gives you a little picture of Ngāi Tahu. But sort of Ngāi Tahu history is interesting in terms of and also sad. This picture here is of New Zealand. On the far left is in 1840. And that area in green was the Ngāi Tahu tribal territory, which is approximately, 3/4 of the South Island and probably about the size of England and Wales. And on the right is what Ngāi Tahu had in terms of ownership by 1860. And those little dots there are the little reserves. And so Ngāi Tahu, within 20 years, 99.9% of the land had been transferred to the government, to the Crown, leaving Ngāi Tahu less than 8 acres per person to subsist on. And those little dots are the reserves in which Ngāi Tahu subsisted. And so we started a project called the Whenua Project, which means the land project, because the alienation from the land is where everything kind of sprung from. And so we explored the historical trauma of land loss and colonisation among Ngāi Tahu, and then we're trying to try to find these culturally relevant solutions to the issues that came from it. And the research explored, first of all, we looked at the sort of demographic characteristic of the research participants, but we mostly built it on participant storytelling. We looked at stories across generations of whānau or families. There's stories of the trauma they'd experienced, both within their families, personally, and also within their interactions with the outside structures, the colonial structures. And then we also analysed health issues and participant survival narratives, and also their sources of well-being. So this is kind of the structure for the project. The research participants, we had nearly 40% males and approximately 60% females, and we had 80 overall for our study. And we broke the study up into these different generations. So we had 60 plus, and then 50 to 59, 36 to 49, 21 to 35. And so that roughly were our cohorts, where we looked across these different generations and the impacts of colonisation upon those generations. In terms of the results, so here we see in the older generation, this is the 60 plus. This on the far left is the 60 plus. Yeah, on the far left is a 60 plus group. Now these were the generation that moved from the village areas to the cities in the they were the first generation of urban Māori. And you can see here that the records of domestic abuse across the families were sort of, and this domestic abuse included sexual abuse, and we didn't break that out with such a small study. And so we're sitting at around 35%, but by the next generation, the reports of domestic abuse had gone up to 72% across the whānau of recorded frequency of abuse and harm, and then drops back down to still a high level over the subsequent 2 generations. And this is kind of trying to match into some of the statistics I was showing you before around the imprisonment rates and so on, how we have this rapid climb from the 1950s onward. Same thing here too, this is rates of mental illness. So in the older generations, we found, much higher levels of psychological health, but then we have a rapid rise in the first urbanisation generation, and then it increasing and just levelling off slightly in the later generations. So once again, we're seeing this sort of significant sort of impact. And it relates strongly to, this is the Māori urbanisation. Once again, a similar sort of pattern of going up. And so I'm just trying to bring all these things connecting together, where we've got this process of urbanisation connecting with increases in violence, which can be correlated at the front to increases in sexual violence against men and boys. So it's kind of this idea that you're seeing these greater, broader trends affecting what happens to individuals and families. Now, these were the results from our study. Now, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but it's a summary of the results. And what it shows is that there were lots of complex reasons leading to this change, leading to this explaining what happened. And it's probably too small for many of you to see, but the presentation will be made available to you afterwards. But in the left-hand side, the far left at the top, we can see that this is the imposition of new political structures, economic structures, social structures, education systems onto Māori. And then we rapidly see, the first thing we see, like I said with Ngāi Tahu, was this rapid rate of land loss. So 99.9% of land for Ngāi Tahu lost within 20 years. Now, with that loss of land comes a whole bunch of problems. The first thing you lose is you lose your autonomy. If you don't have land, if you don't have resources, if you don't have your freedom, you can't choose, you can't be in control of your own life. And this is the first effect. You're not self-determining. You don't have a strong effect or control over your own life. Now, if you don't have land and you don't have resources, you also get poverty. And this was the second major effect. So poverty was a huge issue. In some areas we had, particularly in some areas south here, like Moeraki, we have instances of starvation occurring at a time of incredible wealth in New Zealand in the late 1800s. So with poverty also comes, of course, disease. When you're malnourished and you're stressed, you also get sick. So we also have the narratives in our research of people telling of the stories of people dying and dying of commonly curable diseases. and also the impacts of environmental changes, with a lot of people having to work in conditions, particularly in industrial type activities where they're exposed to chemicals and other things. Now, when you get less land, people start to fight over what's left. And in New Zealand, what the government did was it individualised land title that was held in common. So suddenly, land that everyone tended to have a right over suddenly was all individualised. And so this generated a lot of inter-family conflict. So a lot of and what might have happened even 5 or 6 generations ago, or 3 or 4 generations ago, is still remembered in families. There's still tension, and there's a lot of, and violence over these issues today, over these internal tensions that will go back to who owns land and who owns the resources where. The next one was wahitapu denigration. Wahitapu are sites that a sacred site is the translation to English, which doesn't do it much justice. But generally sites that are deeply meaningful from an identity perspective, deeply meaningful from a spiritual perspective. Many stories of urupa graveyards being turned into dumps or waste sites and this sort of thing. So once again, having this effect that a direct sense of yourself, direct sense of your identity and your connection to place being undermined. The next effect was, of course, the urbanisation, and which I'll show you shortly. Urbanisation was the tipping point. It was an accumulation of traumas that then led to a tipping point. And the last one is, when it comes with urbanisation, you also lose, for Māori, identity is who you are, land is who you are, it's a sense of your place and who you are. So also moving away from your sense of place and where you are is also an undermining a sense of who you are. So a loss of identity related to place. So these things sort of happened sequentially over time and came together. At the same time as when you lose your land and when you lose your sense of autonomy, you have to fit in. You have to fit into the society you're in. So you also get assimilation happening. And with this assimilation, you get identity being undermined, you get your culture undermined, and particularly when assimilation's focused on denigrating you, you also develop self-hatred. And so we had these effects of these traumatic events. And also the common effects of experiencing racism. So that's kind of what the study kind of found in a nutshell. And we've got a large report if anyone's interested that explores that in detail. But what we get is that we find these traumas compound over time. So, and the reason they compound is because the trauma, because of grief and the inability to express grief. So we found within whānau that they couldn't express their sadness and a sense of hurt of what has been happening because it wasn't being acknowledged within broader society what had happened. They had become, and it's called disenfranchised grief. If anyone's interested, it's in terms of disenfranchised grief and related to Indigenous peoples. The Tākini Network explores that in their research in North America. And so we find that the grief can't be expressed, and so the trauma compounds over time. And at the same time, the families tend to live on edge. You never know what's going to happen next. You're always used to the government pulling the rug from under your feet. So there's this sense that you're always going to get hit from behind. And so that sort of compounds. We call that the colonial environment. It's living in an environment of threat. A bit like living in a household where you don't know if you're going to get hit next. But it's like that, living in a society like that. And so that's kind of the general effect, or the sort of the finding from the research. Now, this is pre-1930s. We had a lot of traumas occurring within Ngāi Tahu. So we had racism, we had material poverty, we had assimilation, there was disease, and which was giving rise to a sense of grief, a sense of subjection, being controlled, dominated, sense of alienation and sense of shame. But it was still being balanced Ngāi Tahu lived in their communities still. They still lived in their village on those tiny reserves, but they were still fishing villages. There was still, culture was still to some extent intact. So there was a sense of being nurtured, of belonging, and a sense of pride and status, which come from tino rangatiratanga, so a level of self-determination, tūranga waiwai, sense of belonging to a place, and all those the whānau connections. And this is a good quote to explain it. In that community, we were grown and sheltered and nurtured and all of that. And we were a Māori community. We shared the coal, we shared the fish, we shared the wood, we shared the potatoes. We lived hāpuri Māori. We were the first generations about to come into the urban shift. We were the first generation in the south of urban Māori, and the shock of moving, and we were away from the hāpuri Māori. We were away from the community, and we were growing up amongst neighbours who were uncertain about us entirely. They'd never lived so close to a brown man, so that was the loss. And so then we have this situation occurring where the kind of the safety net, the shelter, the structure of the hapu was undermined at the same time as the sense of having a place of belonging, strong sense of identity, and some sense of self-determination. And this is when we start to see these traumas take off. It's when the traumas outweigh the buffers. And so this is kind of how we're conceiving of these ideas, is that you can cope with so much trauma, but you can only cope with so much trauma. Then it's going to hit a point where things tip. And that's when the graphs I was showing you earlier, where everything starts unraveling. And I think this is, Taonui is sort of the kind of specialist in this area, and I think he kind of explains it really well. And I think this is a good statement which kind of sums it up. We really recognise that colonisation and its committed intergenerational impacts constitute violence. Colonisation is the application of anger on vulnerable peoples. This violence has reciprocal reaction with the societies upon which it is inflicted. Cultural alienation, forced assimilation, and cumulative marginalisation create anger in Indigenous societies. Where this anger is not understood, it becomes internalised within the colonised society and inverts upon itself. The Indigenous oppressed attack each other. Angry men fight each other, sometimes in gangs. The red fights and the blue. Anger seeks the weak and the vulnerable. Violence expresses itself by seeking innocence. Reinculturalizations can emancipate individuals, families, and tribal groups. So with that in mind, Ken, how am I going for time?
You're doing extremely well. You can have another quarter of an hour.
Okay, cheers. So what we have here is these conditions for sexual violence. So we've got the land alienation, we've got the assimilation, we've got the racism. And we've got these things that lead to like loss of autonomy, poverty, disease, and so on. But some of the key ones is around self-hatred and this loss of cultural resources, loss of identity. And this particularly affects masculine identities. And this is kind of where I'll have a look at now, is the way in which the literature explores it and the way in which it's seen as the way colonisation affects masculine identities. But we do know that these things give rise to these emotion states of grief, shame, alienation, and subjection. And to me, those are the cognitive and emotion states that are conducive to sexual violence against men and boys. If you're creating those emotion states in your families and communities, you're creating the conditions for this to occur. So, in terms of a psychological sense, what is colonisation? And so, what is fundamentally an attack on your identity and your wairua, your spirit? So, it's a process of domination. And so, not just there's a physical domination, but it's also a psychological domination. And what happens is the states create political, legal, economic structures that replace or take away Indigenous ones and replace them with other ones. And those new structures are hierarchical and dominant. And they also deliberately attack Indigenous culture and identity. It's a way of maintaining and rationalising control. This is clearly researched and well looked into. And the way in which it happens, and it's often referred to in the research or looked at or talked about, as the colonial narrative. And you can find this narrative in everything from laws to media to literature to state, to society in general within settler states. And what it does is it compares and contrasts. So what it does is it says it portrays Māori as backward and the other society is forward, settler society is forward. You know, you can terms things like developed or undeveloped, or primitive versus modern, or traditional versus modern. These are all colonial terms, and they're used to create an idea that society is evolving in one direction, from the backward to the forward, and so it enables you to position a culture in a backward position, to say they're behind, that you can't learn from it. It has to learn from you. It follows you. And in New Zealand, the main tool in which this was imposed, this way of thinking, was through the education system. So this is a quote from our study, and we've got pages and pages of these quotes. Dad came off as an ignorant Māori, but I think underneath it all, he had a lot more. He was real staunch Māori values and things, but I think he had things happen in his lifetime growing up that he didn't want to be associated with being Māori. He told me that he got caned at school for speaking Māori. I said, "What did you say, Dad?" And he said, "It was kia ora," which means, thank you. And he said kia ora accidentally to the teacher, and he got 6 of the best for that. So, what happens is this way of thinking about yourself as backward and as negative becomes internalized. And we start seeing this a lot from the generation of the 40s. And that's who were adults in the 40s. Dad's always said that if you want to choose any way of life, choose the Pākehā way. That's the European way. His silly old saying was, there are 2 roads. One is the Pākehā side and one is the Māori side. And I always used to take the Pākehā side, the top road. That's what Dad always said, take the top road. So we can see that becoming part of the narrow way of thinking. But we also get this sense that you can be Māori, but you can't be Māori because you can't fit into the broader society either, which is called double alienation. You're not allowed to be Māori, but you're not allowed to be Pākehā either. Grew up in a time when the language was outlawed. It was still spoken at home because the grandparents lived with them. So he's living in a life of paradox and uncertainty. He can do one thing. He can do one thing you're expected, and then you've got to shut it down. So he lived in that paradigm. He lived that now you can, now you can't. So an idea that you don't know what you're allowed to do, what's right or wrong, because both cultures are being, you can't belong in either. And this comes out in a lot of our studies, particularly around those involved in gangs. And this is a statement from a male who was involved in gangs. There was a conflict between my Māori and Pākehā sides, but today there's not a conflict. I don't see a conflict between them, but I did once upon a time. So that was my life, and I guess, although I was down in the dark world, and so I went down the wild track. I was in places, I got to places where I think, what am I doing here? With regards to gang situations and seeing things that was pretty horrible and stuff, and was part of some pretty horrible stuff. So we see these direct connections between this undermining of a strong sense of identity and not belonging and becoming, and this urbanization process and losing contact of who you are and where you're from. And then we see it flow down to the next generation as well, who also don't know who they are. This is a male who's 32. They, the elders, weren't raised with those Māori teachings. They didn't know how to navigate it, so that knowledge never got passed on. So it comes down to the likes of my generation, where we have this almost identity crisis because we have this connection, but a connection to something that we don't understand. In my opinion, it's been a trauma. It's certainly had an impact. And this is sort of reinforced once again by Tānui again. He has this way of summarising things summarising the research that I've looked at. The domestic abuse and child violence we see today begins during the period of urbanisation between 1950 and 1980, when 60% of Māori were urbanised into poor housing areas as cheap unskilled labour in areas vulnerable to economic change. This brought forth new generations of doubly alienated Māori, rejected by the dominant culture and distanced from their ancestral culture, concentrated in poor housing, working for low wages or on welfare, and subject to across-the-board racism. A generation of urban Māori parents who had been born in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s entered on intergenerational cycle of poverty, alcohol, drugs, gang culture, single-parent families, domestic violence, hopelessness and frustration. So we see everything kind of makes sense in terms of when we look at it from this kind of historical perspective. But there's also the specific attack on Māori male identity. And in this, I've just talked about how Māori are portrayed as inferior. There's a scholar called Nandi who explains that colonisation was also based on sex hierarchies. And the settler was often, if you examine the language of settler colonisation, it's often put in male-female terms, with the dominant being the settler and the indigenous being submissive, or the female, sort of mirroring these kind of gender imbalances in Europe. And this is another famous scholar in this area, Baba. He says, the objective of colonial discourse is to construe the colonised as a population of degenerate types on the basis of racial origin in order to justify conquest and establish systems of administration and instruction. So it's not only an idea that that you're submissive, but also that you're degenerate. So there's this idea of implanting these kind of seeds or these ideas that one takes on. And we find this that often in a lot of the language, when you look at New Zealand policy and history, and when talking about when New Zealand was being colonised, you see a lot of things that Māori being portrayed as passive, weak, irrational, and needing to be guided, be tutored by a more aware people, a more developed people, and people who are more aggressive, strong, rational, and honest. And it was this sort of idea and that sort of penetrated the consciousness of New Zealand. And this is sort of explained by Bederman, who says, civilised white men were the most manly ever evolved, firm of character, self-control, protectors of women and children. And this is a contrast to Māori. And also we see it sort of reflecting the power dynamic between parents and children, the dominant subordinate from Europe to colonised context. But however, looking at Māori as children, or Māori males as children, but at the same time, it wasn't as if they were being seen as vulnerable. They also at the same time was sort of harbouring this sort of hidden violence and lust. And you see this continually through the narratives around colonisation. So it kind of leads to this paradox of being both subordinate, vulnerable, but also dangerous. And this is Hoko Whitu talking about, sort of summarising this. In the 19th century, Māori masculine physicality was like the untamed countryside, something to be conquered and civilised. In the 20th century, it was something to be harnessed to provide manual labour for New Zealand's developing colonial nation. In the 21st century, it has become a spectacle played out by the overachievement of Māori on the sports field. Context from Australia. Aboriginal men in particular have been profoundly demeaned by mainstream society and their ability to be worthy people individually, in a family capacity as a parent, as a husband, or as a functioning member of society. Men have been systematically dishonoured and viewed as worthless in the eyes of non-Aboriginal society and by some Aboriginal women. So from behind these statistics today, and the reason I often begin my talks with all the statistics is that people have come to accept or to associate being violent as being Māori or as being the common way things are in those societies, including sexual violence and abuse. However, it is a recent phenomenon, and certainly in terms of the last 30, 40 years, it's only increased above Pākehā in the last 30, 40 years and was well below Pākehā pre-1950. So hopefully I've been able to take you through that historical context, and you now have a pretty good idea of what underpins the culture or the conditions for sexual violence within Māori contexts and communities. So, what are the solutions? Just quickly, I've only got 1 minute. So, first of all, pretty clear that the political economic structures of New Zealand have contributed to this problem or helped create this problem. But fundamentally, it's about a loss of control over your life, a loss of control over your culture and your identity, to be able to have a sense of self-determination. And I think Tāone, once again, sums it up nicely. Reinculturalization can emancipate individuals, families, and tribal groups. So I think focusing in those areas, self-empowerment and control, and strong identity, is probably the key areas for initiatives to work on. And I also think for those of you working in counselling or individually family levels, I think some of the historical trauma approaches can be quite interesting and helpful particularly to take individuals to understanding their own family histories, their own backgrounds, and their own cultural connections. Because I think understanding some of these broader elements contextualizes the problems, and it takes the issue away from the individuals and families and puts it out into the broader society and historical context. So it doesn't drill in onto the individual or the family. Kia ora.